Welcome to Citizen Portal, the federal edition, your go-to source for everything happening in federal politics. Let's dive in and keep you connected to what matters most on the national stage. All right, so we're back and ready for another deep dive. This time it's into this congressional hearing on the censorship industrial complex. We got a ton of listener questions and a whole mountain of material to go through. Transcripts, articles, expert opinions, you name it. So looks like it got a little heated in that hearing.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty controversial topic.
Definitely. But hey, that's what we're here for, to cut through all the noise, figure out what actually went down, and help you understand what it all means. So no opinions from us, just the facts.
Sounds good to me.
Cool. So to kick things off, maybe you can give us the rundown. What exactly is this censorship industrial complex everyone's talking about?
It's a pretty loaded term, right? It was coined by this journalist, Michael Schellenberger, who testified at the hearing. He basically describes it as this network of, well, powerful players all working together to, suppress certain viewpoints. Whether they mean to or not, that's the debate.
Interesting. So who are these powerful players? We're talking about just like big tech here?
It's actually a lot broader than that. We're talking government agencies, international organizations, even universities. Schellenberger specifically called out USAID.
USAID. Wait, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the ones who usually do, like humanitarian aid.
Yep, that's them. He claimed they're funding groups in other countries, specifically Brazil, that are engaged in censorship.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty serious accusation. What kind of censorship are we even talking about?
Well, that's where things get murky. It's not always like blatant government crackdowns. Sometimes it's more subtle, like using hate speech laws to silence dissent or pressuring social media companies to remove certain content.
So is the U.S. involved in this?
Well, that's a big part of the debate. There's this Canadian journalist, Rupa Subramanya. She testified about increasing censorship in democracies like Canada, Germany, Australia. And her concern is that the U.S., even with the First Amendment, could be influenced by these global trends.
It's interesting you say that because a lot of what we're seeing today does feel like a global phenomenon. So what examples did she give? What kind of stuff is happening in these other countries?
Things like hate speech laws being used to stifle dissent, online content being heavily policed, even individuals facing legal trouble for expressing certain views in public. It's kind of a slippery slope.
Yeah, that does sound worrying. So tying this all back to the hearing, what are the main concerns being raised?
I think the core issue is this: who gets to decide what we see and don't see, whether it's online or in public? Where do we draw the line between free speech and censorship?
Okay, so it's about finding that balance.
Right. And of course, you can't talk about online censorship without talking about big tech. Facebook, Twitter, now X. They were a big focus in this hearing.
And the relationship with the government, right? Like how much influence does the government have over what these companies are doing?
Exactly. There were allegations that the Biden administration pressured Facebook to censor information about the origins of COVID-19 and criticism of vaccines.
So that raises a question about the role of these companies. Should they be considered like common carriers obligated to allow all speech? Or do they have the right to moderate content as private entities?
Right, and that's a huge debate with no easy answers. On one hand, you have people saying these platforms are like the new public square, they should be open to everyone. On the other hand, you have people saying these companies have a responsibility to protect their users from harmful content.
It's definitely a tough one. And then you throw Elon Musk into the mix and it gets even more complicated.
Oh, yeah, he's like a whole other layer of this whole thing. His takeover of Twitter and his, outspoken support for free speech have definitely stirred the pot.
Seems like he really threw a wrench into the works, didn't he?
Big time. At the hearing, Democrats labeled him an unelected bureaucrat with too much power, while Republicans praised him for exposing government overreach and advocating for free speech.
So two very different perspectives on him. It's almost like he's this lightning rod for the whole debate.
Totally. I mean, his position is pretty unique, right? He's a major player in the tech world, a government contractor through SpaceX, and was involved in the Trump administration for a bit. It's hard not to wonder about conflicts of interest and whether he has access to sensitive information.
It's definitely a lot to unpack there. And speaking of the Trump administration, I noticed that the Hunter Biden laptop controversy came up quite a bit in this hearing.
Yeah, that story became a focal point for discussions about media bias and the potential suppression of information, especially during the 2020 election.
Remind us about that story again.
So it was initially dismissed by many as, Russian disinformation, but was later verified by the New York Times and others. Basically, it raised concerns about whether the media was trying to bury a story that could have hurt Biden's campaign.
So it wasn't just about censorship happening now, but also about how past actions, like suppressing this story, could have shaped public perception and maybe even impacted the election outcome.
Right, exactly. The hearing really brought to light this concern that maybe we haven't been getting the full picture, and that some information, whether true or false, has been deliberately kept from us.
Okay, so that leads us to this bigger theme that I kept seeing in the material, this idea of a war on truth and the rise of disinformation online.
Yeah, that was a major talking point, especially for Matt Taibbi, the investigative journalist. He argued that government agencies are actively trying to shape the narrative and censor dissenting voices.
So who is he specifically pointing fingers at?
Well, he called out organizations like the Election Integrity Partnership, which worked with government agencies to, flag potential disinformation online.
But that brings up another question, right? Who decides what's disinformation in the first place? Isn't there a risk that those in power could abuse that label to silence their critics?
Exactly. And that's what Taibbi and others are concerned about. They're arguing that these efforts, even if they're well-intentioned, could be used to unfairly target and silence certain viewpoints. And they're worried about institutions like Stanford University partnering with the government on these initiatives.
It does make you wonder where the line is. Is the government trying to protect us from harmful information, or are they overreaching and potentially stifling free speech?
That's the big question, and it's one we'll keep digging into as we go deeper into this whole censorship industrial complex.
Yeah, it feels like we're constantly trying to find that middle ground, right? Between letting people say whatever they want and, preventing actual harm.
It's a tough one for sure. I mean, no one's saying we should just let anything go online, but figuring out where that line is and who gets to draw it, that's the tricky part.
Definitely. And the hearing brought up these two main perspectives. You've got people who are like, yeah, just let the marketplace of ideas do its thing. Let people debate it out, even if it gets a little messy.
So basically a more hands-off approach. Their argument is that even if you're trying to do good, attempts to control harmful content can be used to silence people you don't agree with.
And they probably point to things like the Hunter Biden laptop story as proof that powerful people can manipulate what we see online, right?
Exactly. It's like, who do you trust to decide what's true and what's not? But then on the other side, you have people who are like, no, we need some rules, like hate speech, misinformation, calls to violence. That stuff can cause real harm.
So they're saying platforms have a responsibility to protect people from that.
Exactly. They argue that a hands-off approach just leads to online extremism and conspiracy theories running wild.
So both sides have valid points. And it sounds like this hearing really showed just how tough it is to find a solution that protects free speech and protects people.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, how do you balance those two things? There's no easy answer.
One thing that stood out to me was this concern that the line between the government and big tech is getting blurry. Like there's this worry that the government is putting pressure on these platforms to censor stuff they don't like.
Right. And that's a valid concern. We've already seen examples where government officials have asked platforms to remove content. And who's to say that pressure won't increase?
It's almost like a slippery slope, right? And then you throw Elon Musk into the mix and it becomes even more complicated. You have a billionaire with strong opinions on free speech who also has connections to the government. It's like, where does the accountability lie?
Yeah, Musk taking over Twitter definitely shook things up, and his decision to release the Twitter files, all those internal communications about content moderation, that really fueled the debate.
Oh, yeah. And what about those community notes he introduced? That crowdsourced fact-checking thing. Some people loved it, others were skeptical.
Yeah, that's a good example of how tricky this all is. Some people saw it as a step towards transparency, others thought it could be easily manipulated. It's still kind of early to say what the long-term impact will be. But it's clear that Musk's involvement has made an already complex issue even more complex.
Absolutely. And this isn't just a U.S. problem either. Remember what Rupa Subramanya said about censorship in other democracies? It's happening everywhere.
Oh, yeah. Places like Canada, Germany, Australia, it's definitely worrying. They're using hate speech laws to silence people who disagree with the government. They're expanding surveillance powers. They're pressuring social media companies to do what they say. It's not a good look.
It makes you wonder if there's this bigger trend happening. Is there a global push to restrict what people can say online? And what does that mean for democracy?
It's a big question, and I think if we care about free speech, we need to be paying attention to what's happening, not just in the U.S., but everywhere. We need to challenge attempts to silence people, and we need to hold those in power accountable.
It all comes back to that, doesn't it? Holding people accountable. And I think more than anything, this whole hearing highlighted the need to keep talking about this, to really engage with different viewpoints, to challenge our own assumptions, and to try to find solutions that actually work for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. This isn't going to be solved overnight, but I think if we can talk about it openly and honestly, Maybe we can start moving towards a future where free speech is actually protected, both online and offline.
Well said. This whole hearing, it just showed how tangled up everything is. You've got government agencies, tech companies, these like shadowy organizations, powerful individuals. It's like a giant web, everyone pulling strings.
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming, but I think that's why it's so important to break it down. Because this isn't just some abstract debate. This is about real people's lives, their ability to speak their minds, their access to information, and the stakes are high.
So true. I mean, think about some of the stuff we've been talking about. People having their bank accounts frozen for supporting a protest. Journalists getting silenced for reporting on things the government doesn't want them to. Scientists getting censored for challenging the status quo. This isn't just happening in, like, authoritarian regimes. It's happening here. And it feels like it's getting worse.
Yeah, and that's what's so troubling. Like, we're seeing more and more laws and regulations designed to restrict what people can say online, and the pressure on social media companies to, like, do what the government tells them is just growing and growing.
It's like we're sleepwalking into this dystopian future where we can't say anything that the government doesn't approve of.
It's a scary thought, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. We still have the power to push back against this. We can support organizations that are fighting for free speech. We can hold our elected officials accountable, and we can make our voices heard.
You know, it's funny, there's this irony to the whole hearing, right? You have a bunch of lawmakers, many of whom have complained about censorship, having a public debate about censorship. Like, the system is working even as people are criticizing it.
That's a really good point. I think it shows that democracy is messy. It's about this constant back and forth between different ideas and interests, and it requires people to be willing to have tough conversations even when they disagree.
And it requires people to be informed, right? Like, to really understand the issues, to consider different viewpoints, and to be willing to challenge those in power.
Absolutely. I think that's what we're trying to do with these deep dives. We're trying to give you the tools you need to understand what's happening in the world and to make informed decisions.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the key players, the different viewpoints, how this is a global issue. But what's the takeaway for our listeners? What do you want them to remember from all this?
I think the most important thing is that this is a complex issue. It's not black and white. There's no easy answers. And it's not about good guys versus bad guys. It's about these fundamental tensions between free speech and responsibility, between the power of the government and individual liberty.
And it's not just some theoretical debate. Like, this is affecting people's lives in real ways. We're talking about declining trust in institutions, increasing polarization, and a real threat to the free flow of information.
Yeah. And ultimately, it comes down to each of us deciding what we value, what we're willing to tolerate, and what we're willing to fight for.
It's a lot to think about, that's for sure. But I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We can choose to be informed. We can choose to engage in these conversations. And we can choose to hold those in power accountable.
That's right. And maybe, even more importantly, we can choose to be kind, respectful, and open-minded, even when we're talking to people who see things differently. Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together.
I like that. It's been a lot to take in. But I keep coming back to this question, right? Like, if we accept that some level of content moderation is necessary online to prevent, violence and stuff, how do we make sure it doesn't turn into this tool for silencing people? Or, like, manipulating what everyone thinks?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's tough, but I think transparency and accountability are key.
What do you mean by that?
Well, platforms like these social media companies need to be open about how they make decisions about content. What's allowed, what isn't. They need to explain clearly what types of content are prohibited and why. And there needs to be a clear process if you think they made a wrong call. Like a way to appeal.
So no more algorithms making decisions in the background without us knowing how they work.
Ideally, yeah, the more transparent these processes are, the harder it is to abuse them for, political or ideological reasons.
Makes sense. And what about accountability? Like, how do we make sure these platforms are actually held responsible for their actions?
That's where the government might have a role. Now, I'm cautious about government overreach, right? But I think there's a place for regulation, to make sure these platforms are playing fair and being responsible.
So it's all about finding that balance again. Protecting free speech, but also preventing harm.
Exactly. It's delicate, but it's a balance we got to strive for. The alternative, a world where, information is controlled and you can't speak your mind, that's not a good place to be.
Something that really struck me during this hearing was, the urgency. A lot of these witnesses, they seemed genuinely worried. Like, they're raising a flag saying, hey, free speech is under attack. And it feels like that threat is growing.
Yeah, and I think they're right to be concerned. We've seen how quickly things can change, how easily these tools of censorship can be used to, shape public opinion and shut people up. We need to be aware of that and ready to push back.
It's a call to action, isn't it? Like a reminder that free speech is precious. It's not something we can just assume will always be there. we have to defend it actively.
100%. And that's on all of us.
So where do we go from here? What can people listening do to make a difference?
Well, I think the first step always is to stay informed. Pay attention to what's happening not just in the U.S., but globally.
Don't just take things at face value, like dig deeper, question what you're told, consider different sides of the story.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to speak up. Support organizations that are fighting for free speech, contact with representatives, have those tough conversations with people who disagree with you.
Be the change you want to see, right?
Yeah, pretty much. The future of free speech, it really depends on each of us being willing to stand up and defend it.
Well said. I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive. It's been, well, fascinating and honestly a little unsettling at times, this whole censorship industrial complex.
I agree, but I hope it's left you with a better understanding of how important free speech is and, a commitment to protecting it.
And maybe just a little bit of healthy skepticism about who's trying to control the narrative, right?
A bit of skepticism never hurts, but really, I hope you're walking away from this feeling empowered.
Yeah, empowered to think for yourself, question things, and make your voice heard.
Because at the end of the day, the strongest defense against censorship is an informed and engaged public.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with one last thought to chew on. If this censorship industrial complex is as powerful and widespread as some people believe, how can we be sure we're not already living in its shadow? That's something to think about. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going. Thanks for tuning in to Citizen Portal. We hope you feel more informed and ready to engage with the issues shaping our community. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an update, and visit us at citizenportal.ai for more insights on how local politics are impacting you. Until then, stay engaged, stay informed, and remember, your voice matters.